Hello, everybody. I'm so happy to see you're still here. You've bear with us for 2 very intense days of conversation, and it's only going to get more intense. I'm very honored.
Do you have any entertainment out there? We are the entertainment.
Oh yeah, we're closing entertainment for everybody. They're expecting a comedy roast, I'm sure. I'm really honored to be joined by the ambassador, who I won't go through his really distinguished background because we are going to accomplish the impossible and have the fastest fireside chat of all time on a really, really hard issue, the nickel pickle. So, Ambassador, I want to get right to it with you. You know, this is the topic that's been permeating throughout conversations in the conference. It's the convergence of market challenges, pricing challenges, standards, and the ability to have, you know, these resilient supply chains. And Australia is really in the middle of it. So, you know, yesterday we got great insight into the past couple of months on the nickel side. So maybe we'll pick off from where we left off and just get to the real human impact of what's happening with nickel in Australia as a result of these market dynamics, A, and then B, what does this mean for Australia's ability to serve the global transition to a minerals-based economy, electrification?
Well, thanks. Australia, as you know, is a very big mining country, has been for a very long time. 3 of the world's largest mining companies are Australian. We've done it for 150 years in some cases, so we know what we're doing. Secondly, in the hard rocks and in terms of critical minerals, of which nickel is one, if you go to your periodic table, basically you find most of it in Australia. First largest supplier in the world of lithium, 3rd or 4th largest in terms of cobalt, rare earths following not far after that, and nickel probably 5th largest. So let's cut to the chase on nickel. Around the world at the moment, what we would say, I think, is there is a market failure on nickel. And that's because you have a single dominant player, both as a monopoly producer and also as a monopsonistic purchaser. And so you put those 2 factors together, and when you get sort of 80% concentration with a single player, frankly, market principles collapse, which is why you've seen in recent times 5 or 6 nickel operations in Australia go into pause, let's say. So the key question, given that challenge, is what do we do about it? We can either admire the problem or do something about it, and what the government in Australia is seeking to do with partners in the United States and Canada is to do stuff about it.
So let's hear maybe a little bit more about that. You've done a great job, as have several of the companies that you've implicated, really underscoring the challenge that we're facing with nickel today. But how are we turning this talk into action? What policies are we going to utilize to solve this problem? Robbie was saying backstage that this is the face of all of that we are struggling with at this conference as we transition, and it has a name now in nickel. So really, really interested to hear how you're building on policies, how you're developing new ones, how we have a green premium.
Okay, good. Well, one point that's been necessary in the entire transition debate, because not everyone's completely across it, is the fundamental role of nickel and lithium in battery production and therefore the production of EVs, which is fundamental to renewable energy transformation around the world. But if you don't have a reliable and frankly, ESG-compatible supply of nickel or lithium, then frankly, you're going to be defeating your own purpose, which is where this big monopolistic, monopsonistic player comes into the market. So that's the definition of the problem. What can you do about it? I think one of the things that governments are now discussing, we're listening very closely to the industry, companies like, you know, BHP and Wyloo, that's Fortescue, and Australia, but others as well, is that a minimum level of transparency is at time to develop a different listing mechanism for the price of ESG-compatible nickel. Nickel has a different chemical composition. For example, when you're producing stainless steel, which is how it's listed, for example, crudely on the London Metal Exchange, as opposed to battery-grade nickel, which is what we're talking about. So I think the time has come for there to be 2 separate listings. LME don't like that, and they should answer to the world why, because I think now there is a clear emerging demand in the marketplace to service this additional need. So pillar number 1 of transformation of processed critical minerals market, starting with nickel, is to have better, more transparent listing arrangements, which enables 2, suppliers to then use said exchange, and 3, OEMs and others to step up to the plate and indicate that they would use it. Of course, this gets down to the nitty-gritty question of price. I don't push that to one side. But these are the sorts of discussions that we're now engaged in.
And so on getting this new listing for battery-grade nickel, nickel sulfate, how is that conversation going? Are the end users interested in having this different pricing mechanism to see potentially the opportunity to pay for higher standard sourced nickel that you have in Australia, Canada, and other parts of the world to then drive those standards in the places that don't currently adhere to them as closely?
We see end users, including OEMs, will over time have to respond to IRA requirements anyway. And so therefore, you're going to need to be looking at listing arrangements which are specific to inputs which are IRA compatible. And that means embedding ESG standards of the type you use in the United States, the type you use in Australia, the type you use in Canada, into the one, as it were, approach. And so therefore, a number of OEMs can see the future coming. And the IRA compatibility crossover date is probably around 27 or 28, in which case we're in 2024 now. So this is not, this is not Futurama. This is in the here and now. So that still doesn't solve your immediate price gap problem. But here's the other factor that people are putting into their mind. If you allow this industry to simply collapse into the hands of a single monopolistic, monopsonistic player, then what happens, you're also beginning to engender long-term uncertainties about supply. And furthermore, if you have a single player in nickel, think about what therefore happens once all the competition's eliminated in terms of future manipulation of price. In other words, it's the hazard of trust and antitrust, which you in the United States dealt with more than 100 years ago in US economic law. So for those reasons, you've got a number of OEMs looking at long-term ESG requirements coming in anyway because of the IRA, but also what their shareholders and stakeholders are saying separate to that. And then on top of that, you've got this parallel concern about future manipulation of price and or provision of supply if there are geopolitical problems in the future. So I think that's why a number of players out there are, frankly, engaged not just theoretically, but in a very practical way with this discussion. It doesn't overcome the immediate question of price, and governments are now wrestling with this, but I'm confident we can land something.
That's great to hear, this degree of optimism. You mentioned working with Canada, so I'm curious, how do you see, and maybe this is in the other pillars of driving higher standard supply chains here as we start to diversify a very, very concentrated supply chain, not only for nickel, but for the other commodities that you mentioned that are needed for the clean energy transition. So how is the conversation with Canada on this going? Are you talking to some of these African countries that have sulfide deposits, nickel sulfide deposits as well, where they're trying to do this to a certain standard? Is there a coalition of the interested that are trying to work on this?
I think the truth is that many of our countries around the world have been slow to realise the dimensions of the challenge. And this is no criticism of any government in particular. It's just it's taken a while for everyone to reverse engineer what's happening vis-a-vis nickel, what's happening with critical minerals more generally, where nickel goes, see that as a market leader for where lithium goes vis-a-vis monopoly and monopsony. And then look at what's happening in terms of finished products vis-a-vis the EV market itself. And so for those reasons, countries have sort of looked at the manifestation of the problem with nickel companies operating on ESG standards falling over, some lithium mines and processes finding the same problem, and then the emergence of problems in the auto sector itself. So here, through the Critical Minerals Compact between Australia and the United States, signed by the Prime Minister, Prime Minister Albanese, and President Biden last year at the G7 at Hiroshima, we've been working like Trojans since then to turn vision into reality. And the Canadians are now engaged in separate conversations through our Resources Minister, Madeleine King, including just last week in Canada and down here in Washington. I think you had Amos Hochstein around the table here earlier today. And so Amos and the rest of the US government team and ourselves wrestling this to the ground. We're very mindful of alternative sources of supply around the world. We understand some of those complexities. We also understand the complexity on the demand side, which is what do the OEMs do in the interim as well. But I've got to say there are a lot of powerful minds at work on this as we speak.
I'm curious, for those of you who don't know, Ambassador Rudd was previously Prime Minister himself of Australia, and so comes at this issue with an incredible amount of leadership and knowledge. So I'm curious, when you were Prime Minister, was this topic at all percolating? Have we seen this coming? Obviously, as a mineral-rich country, as a mining exporter with incredible amounts of expertise, Australia cares about these issues deeply. But how did this manifest when you were back in Canberra, if at all?
The truth, I mean, by trade, I'm a China specialist. I mean, that's what I cut my teeth on. I'm a Chinese linguist. I worked in our embassy in Beijing. Before I started sliding down the food chain of life into politics, and ended up as Prime Minister. So I've looked at this both through the national interest lens, what is China doing in the world lens, as well as the specifics of, frankly, the benefit which Australia represents to the world as having in its possession 9 of the 10 most relevant critical minerals at scale already producing, and then you add graphite, then our prospectivity and potential is huge as well. So we come to it with a sense of national responsibility to our own industry in terms of its wealth generation capability, but secondly, we have an emerging sense of global responsibility. I left office just on about a decade ago. These trend lines were barely emerging. That's just the truth of it. And I think it's taken us a while, including those of us who are specialist analysts of the Chinese economy, to understand the sheer impact of the scale of the Chinese economy as a purchaser and as a supplier, particularly if you have significant hands of state actors in the middle of both. And that is why we are all wrestling, whether it's with critical minerals, whether it's with energy, whether it is with energy more broadly, whether it is with finished manufacturing goods such as EVs, but more broadly across the spectrum, or look at the debate now unfolding in relation to high technology. This is the same wrestling with challenges to markets by an economic actor of unprecedented scale. And so part of our challenge is to cause our Chinese friends to fully embrace their global climate and sustainability responsibilities. Part of the challenge is for us to operate within the realities of contemporary geopolitics and to construct, to the greatest extent we can, reliable, safe, secure and green supply chains, not just for nickel, but across the critical minerals category for the economies of the world, in particular those who would be vulnerable in the future.
So we have about a minute and a half left here, so I want to give you one last opportunity to maybe send a message to the audience. We've got people from the Hill here, we've got people across critical mineral supply chains, juniors, refiners, processors, we have OEMs in the room. We were just with Undersecretary Fernandez, who's up next behind stage, people who care about the multinational coalition building of these issues. What do you leave them with? You know, bring us back to maybe that optimism. Will we have more nickel production in Australia and Canada? Or are we going to be stuck with all these wonderful alternatives that we heard about yesterday?
Okay, according to this clock, I have an hour and... No, it's 1 minute and 3 seconds to make the pitch.
Yeah.
I was just warming up. In politics, we never do things by half. I think the bottom line is this. 1, communicating the reality of the challenge and the problem. That of itself begins to change consciousness and push us in the direction of policy solutions rather than the permanent admiration of the problem. To give you one classic example, beyond nickel, lithium. We have one of the largest lithium mines in the world in Western Australia, Greenbushes. Here is the dynamics for the whole industry worldwide. 1 in 4 devices in the world currently uses lithium, which can be sourced from that single mine. The world economy, therefore, has an interest in us sustaining an ESG-compatible set of operations in Australia, Canada, the US, and elsewhere, so that we can be reliable suppliers to the global economy for the future. Some will say, well, don't know if we can all afford a green premium. I would say to you all, it ain't a green premium, it's a security premium. Security of supply, it also is clean on the way through, and also safe for workers, which I think is of importance to all folks around the world, or at least it should be.
That's a great way of putting it. Thank you so much, Ambassador, for joining us today. And thank you guys for standing with us. Please join me in thanking Ambassador Rudd.